The ramp shuddered down, spitting seawater and shingle onto the Normandy sand. It was June 7th, 1944. Dawn was a dull, smoky gray, the air thick with the metallic scent of cordite and the low, incessant moan of the wounded. Private Medgar Evers, a tall, lean man from Decatur, Mississippi, did not hesitate. His boots struck the blood-soaked gravel of Omaha Beach. Just yesterday, this beach had been a cauldron of fire and death. Today, it was a logistics nightmare, a maze of wrecked German defenses and newly arrived American supplies. Evers was not a combat infantryman. He was part of the 387th Port Battalion, a segregated unit of stevedores, tasked with the brutal, endless work of unloading the materials that would fuel the liberation of Europe. He saw the faces of the dead, still half submerged in the tidal pools, their skin pale against the dark sand. He smelled the deep, acrid burn of destruction that seemed to cling to everything. In his hands, he gripped the cargo net of ammunition crates he was hauling off the landing craft. Every heavy step was for democracy, for freedom, for the eradication of an ideology built on racial supremacy. This was the cause that had pulled him 3,000 miles from home, a cause he believed in with a conviction hardened by the daily indignities of a segregated life. Yet, even as the distant rumble of artillery echoed the gravity of the mission, a profound, chilling irony settled over him. Here, on the coast of France, he was a liberator, entrusted with the success of the greatest military operation in history. But back in Mississippi, his uniform would not grant him the right to drink from the same water fountain as a white German prisoner of war. The fight was clear in Europe. At home, the front line was invisible, insidious, and waited for him with a patience that was far more dangerous than any German machine gun nest. The war against fascism was external. The war against injustice was woven into the very fabric of the country he was risking his life to save. The Second World War was fought, officially, to preserve freedom from tyranny. It was a global convulsion that demanded total effort and sacrifice from every segment of American society. For the roughly 1 million African Americans who served in the United States military, this conflict presented an agonizing moral paradox. They were called upon to defeat an enemy that preached racial purity and conquest, while they themselves were confined to a military and a nation that enforced racial segregation, a system rooted in the same destructive philosophy they were asked to oppose. This duality shaped the entire generation of black service members. It was a cognitive dissonance that could not be reconciled by a simple act of patriotism. It demanded a choice: endure the hypocrisy and fight for the abstract ideal of America, or reject the call of a country that did not yet fully recognize their humanity. The vast majority chose to serve, not in ignorance of the contradiction, but with the grim determination that their service, their blood, would finally purchase the rights they had been so long denied. Medgar Evers embodied this generation's crucible. He saw the stakes in Europe, the destruction of human potential by systematic hatred, and he understood its reflection in the rigid social architecture of the American South. His time in the service, unloading vital supplies under fire in the French theater, was not merely a military duty. It was an education in global justice and an apprenticeship in confrontation. He fought for America abroad, enduring the shells and the danger of the combat zone. But the true defining battle of his life began the moment he stepped off the troop ship and back onto American soil. The story of Medgar Evers is not just a chapter in the history of the civil rights movement. It is the story of a promise broken and then fiercely reclaimed. It is the story of how the very act of serving in the war against fascism generated an unstoppable moral force, a demand for equality that could no longer be ignored. For men like Evers, the enemy was not just the Axis powers. The enemy was the expectation that they would return home, fold their uniforms, and quietly accept the status quo. They refused. Their global victory gave them a moral authority that the system was utterly unprepared to handle. The ultimate fight for America was not won in Berlin or Tokyo. It was won brick by arduous brick in the streets of the American South, by veterans who knew the true meaning of tyranny and liberty.
The systemic marginalization of African Americans in 1940s America was not a spontaneous social phenomenon. It was the deliberate design of the Jim Crow system, a legal and cultural scaffolding built upon the ruins of Reconstruction. The roots of this ideological segregation ran deep, far predating the global conflict. The very concept of the separate but equal doctrine established by the Plessy v. Ferguson Supreme Court case in 1896 provided the legal framework for racial separation in all facets of life: schools, transportation, hospitals, and, critically, the military. When the Second World War erupted in Europe, the United States Army was not only segregated, it was reluctant to accept black soldiers in combat roles. The prevailing military and political belief, often based on pseudo-scientific racial theories, was that black soldiers lacked the intellectual capacity or emotional fortitude for complex combat. Instead, they were channeled overwhelmingly into service and support units, quartermaster companies, engineer regiments, and port battalions, the grueling, unglamorous backbone of the logistical effort. Medgar Evers' world, the world of rural Mississippi, was the epicenter of this system. Born in 1925, he grew up breathing the air of absolute economic and social control. He witnessed the casual brutality of the system firsthand. The signs, white only, colored, were not mere suggestions. They were visible expressions of an entrenched power structure, backed by economic reprisal and the ever-present threat of violence. Yet there was also a tradition of fierce dignity and resistance within the African American community, passed down from generation to generation. The lessons of resilience, of subtle and overt defiance, were the true inheritance of every young black man in the South. The ideological contrast of the war made this domestic system impossible to ignore. American propaganda relentlessly emphasized the difference between their democratic way of life and the tyrannical, race-obsessed doctrines of Nazi Germany. But in the segregated barracks, black soldiers were constantly reminded that the America they were fighting for was an America that did not fully believe in them. The irony was so stark, it was almost unbearable. They were being asked to die for principles that were systematically denied to them in life. This tension fueled the Double V campaign, a grassroots movement that swept through Black America. The V stood for victory, twice. Victory abroad against the Axis powers, and victory at home against racism and segregation. It was a potent, simple summation of their mission. For Medgar Evers, enlisting in 1943 was an act that simultaneously affirmed his patriotism and his demand for change. He was not just signing up to fight Hitler, he was signing up to earn the right to fight Jim Crow. His overseas service, therefore, was never just about the European war. It was the strategic opening move in a conflict that he knew he would have to lead, not from a battlefield, but from a voter registration table in Jackson, Mississippi. The sheer scale of the military's internal segregation, the systemic refusal to treat its soldiers equally, became the strongest possible argument for civil rights upon their return. The system that was designed to contain them, instead, forged a generation of disciplined, organized, and politically awakened veterans. The journey across the Atlantic in 1944 placed Private Evers not only in a new theater of operations, but into the crucible of military hierarchy. Despite the global stakes, the institutional rigidity of segregation dominated the U.S. Army's overseas deployment.
The black service units, like the 387th Port Battalion, were vital to the logistical pipeline, the unsung, essential muscle of the war machine. Yet their contribution was consistently marginalized, their presence minimized in official reports, and their success often met with patronizing surprise rather than recognition. The initial work on the beaches of Normandy was a relentless, grinding test of endurance and nerve. The danger was not always the spectacular firefight, it was the persistent threat of German shelling, the constant risk of underwater obstacles, and the sheer, back-breaking labor under the indifferent gaze of the European sky. Evers and his comrades worked 12, sometimes 18 hours a day, wading through freezing water, wrestling heavy equipment off ships. They were the engines of supply, turning the trickle of D-Day into the flood necessary for General Patton's tanks to break out. There was a subtle institutional ridicule in their deployment. They were often viewed by some of their white peers and superiors less as fellow soldiers and more as necessary laborers. The prevailing, deeply ingrained prejudice suggested that they were only capable of manual tasks, unfit for the intellectual and strategic challenges of combat. This view, rooted in decades of racial stereotyping, led to constant undersupply of their units and a lack of proper equipment, a daily, quiet expression of systemic arrogance that they were forced to endure. However, the sheer necessity of the war gradually eroded the fiction of their incompetence. In the chaos of the forward operating areas, under the pressure of continuous threat, it quickly became evident that the work of the Black Port Battalions was essential. Without the hundreds of thousands of tons of material they unloaded, the Allied offensive would stall. It was the weight of empirical reality pressing against ideological prejudice. The German army did not recognize the color bar. A shell burst was indiscriminate. And in the face of genuine external danger, the manufactured divisions of the American military began to show their absurdity. Evers saw the European landscape change. He moved through devastated towns where the local population, having lived under the shadow of Nazi race laws, often showed him a dignity and simple recognition that was revolutionary compared to the South. A black man in uniform was a liberator, a soldier, not a segregated anomaly. This external validation, the genuine appreciation from the freed French and Belgian populations, acted as a silent indictment of the American system. The ridicule they faced from within the ranks was countered by the awe they received from the newly liberated world. The deep-seated arrogance of Jim Crow had designed a soldier who would serve and then vanish. But the experience of fighting abroad had forged a man who had seen the enemy, seen the stakes, and recognized that the fight for freedom was indivisible. The skills learned, the discipline, the organization, the capacity to operate under hostile pressure were not just tools for the port of Cherbourg. They were the precise attributes necessary to wage the next war, the one waiting for him at the bus station back in Mississippi. The arrogance of the system had inadvertently trained its own executioners.
The troop ship, scarred by the Atlantic crossing, docked in the early summer of 1946. Medgar Evers, now honorably discharged, stood tall on the gangplank, his uniform neatly pressed, his mind filled with the sharp, clear images of a world-shattering conflict. He was a veteran of Omaha Beach, a participant in the liberation of a continent. He wore the bronze service ribbons that testified to his courage and his duty. He had fought a war for liberty. The moment of confrontation did not take place in a government office or a courtroom. It occurred in his hometown of Decatur, Mississippi, at a local filling station. Evers, along with his younger brother Charles, was driving his 1946 Chevrolet, a symbol of his new post-war life, on the way to vote. It was a primary election day, and Evers, like many returning black veterans, intended to exercise the right he had earned. They drove up to the station and stopped the car. It was hot.
the humid Mississippi air heavy and still, smelling of gasoline and dust. Evers noticed the group of local white men loitering near the pumps, their faces carrying the look of casual, proprietary expectation common in the South. As he reached to open his car door, one of the men detached himself from the group. He was wearing overalls and a faded cap, his posture radiating a quiet menace. "Where you think you're going, boy?" the man asked, his voice low, a deliberate drawl that stripped Evers of his rank, his service, and his manhood. Evers stepped out of the car, fully aware of the danger. He stood straight, consciously holding the authority of his uniform. "To vote," he replied, his voice calm, clear, and without deference. He gestured toward his brother, who remained silently in the driver's seat. The polling place was just a short walk away. The man laughed, a short, ugly, dismissive sound. Another man joined him, then another. They formed a slow, deliberate semicircle. "Niggers don't vote round here," the first man stated, spitting on the ground near Evers' highly polished military shoe. "You been up north too long, soldier. You forgot how things work." Evers felt the blood surge, the adrenaline of combat returning. This was not a German pillbox. This was a personal, intimate tyranny. He looked at the white men, meeting their gaze not with fear, but with the cold, assessing focus of a man who had seen worse. His uniform, intended to be a shield of honor, was instead a target. It signified an equality they refused to concede. One of the men reached out and roughly grabbed the fabric of Evers' jacket near the shoulder patch. "Take that monkey suit off, boy. It ain't yours." The insult was the flashpoint. Evers did not strike back. He did not raise his voice. He simply held his ground, his eyes locked on the aggressor. The sheer, unyielding presence of the decorated veteran, the man who had faced the true storm, communicated a silent, absolute refusal to back down. The tension stretched taut, a moment suspended between violence and retreat. Charles Evers, witnessing the immediate threat to his brother, slowly reached under the seat. The white men saw the movement, a shift in the equation. For the first time, they hesitated. The veterans, they realized, were no longer the frightened, deferential youths who had left town. They were disciplined, trained, and now they were willing to die for a single basic constitutional right. The first man shoved Evers one last time, a pathetic, impotent act of final assertion. "Get on back to the house. Go on." He stepped away, the others following, their bravado shattered by the veteran's refusal to break eye contact. Medgar and Charles Evers got back into the car. They did not vote that day, but the encounter was a watershed. The incident was far more than a simple act of intimidation. It was a psychological turning point. In that moment, Medgar Evers understood with absolute certainty that the fight for America was still ongoing, that the ideals he had bled for abroad were a lie at home, and that this new internal war would require the same courage, the same strategy, and the same discipline he had learned on the beaches of Normandy. He had not lost, he had simply located the enemy, and the sight of their fear, the fear of a man who knew his rights, was a profound validation of his mission. The conflict Medgar Evers now engaged in, the fight for civil rights, was not fought with tanks and artillery, but with a highly refined and equally effective arsenal of legal, economic, and psychological tactics. His military service, though logistical in nature, had inadvertently provided him with a strategic template for this new domestic battlefield. The core of his subsequent work lay in applying the discipline of logistics and reconnaissance to the deeply complex, often hidden mechanisms of the Jim Crow system. First, there was the necessity of information warfare, or what became known as documentation. Just as military intelligence relies on accurate, timely reporting, Evers realized that the movement needed irrefutable proof of the system's brutality. As an early field officer for the NAACP, his work was meticulous and relentless. He was a human reconnaissance drone, traveling the rural roads of Mississippi, gathering affidavits, recording specific instances of voter denial, economic intimidation, and violence. These details were not emotional pleas, they were evidence, data points that could be used to construct a legal and moral case. His reports were the operational intelligence, providing the raw material for future legal offensives. Second, he understood the power of operational security, or OPSEC, and coordinated movements. The fight against Jim Crow was inherently dangerous. Informers were everywhere, and the cost of a mistake could be deadly. Evers did not rely on spontaneous protest. He built networks of trust, establishing communication channels between isolated communities. Meetings were held in secret, often late at night in churches or private homes. The movement adopted a cellular structure, protecting the whole by limiting the exposure of any single part, a classic guerrilla tactic adapted for nonviolent resistance. Third, he employed strategic deployment of resources. The resources were not materiel, they were people, money, and legal expertise. Evers' key tactical decision was the use of the economic boycott. In places like Jackson, Mississippi, he targeted white-owned businesses that refused to hire black people or that practiced blatant discrimination. This was a direct application of logistical pressure, cutting the supply lines of capital. A successful boycott, meticulously organized and sustained, functioned like a siege, compelling change by financial attrition. The logic was simple. Without black money, white businesses could not thrive. Finally, and most powerfully, was the tactic of moral suasion through direct action. The decision to attempt to vote in 1946 was a prelude to this. Direct, nonviolent confrontation, attempting to integrate schools, lunch counters, or, most dangerously, attempting to register to vote, was a deliberate strategic maneuver. It forced the violence of the state into the public eye. Just as a commander forces the enemy to reveal their strength, Evers' tactics forced Jim Crow to reveal its brutal core. The ensuing violence, recorded and publicized, became the propaganda that turned national sentiment. Evers' skill was in moving the struggle from an emotional plea to a strategic campaign. He was a veteran who saw the civil rights movement not as a protest, but as an operation. He brought the discipline, the cool-headed calculation, and the relentless focus of the military to a social conflict. His experience on the beaches of France had taught him the necessity of persistence, the value of reliable logistics, and the fact that an organized, determined minority, well supplied with moral truth, can defeat a powerful, entrenched enemy. The true genius of Medgar Evers lay not just in his bravery, but in his recognition that the strategies of war could be perfectly repurposed for the architecture of peace. The deployment of these new tactics reached an operational peak during the early 1960s in Jackson, Mississippi. Jackson was not merely a city. It was the stronghold, the administrative and cultural heart of Mississippi's segregationist doctrine. To break Jackson was to strike a debilitating blow at the entire system. Evers' strategic objective was to force the city to integrate its public facilities and hire black citizens in municipal and retail jobs. The initial phase of his operation focused on the economic boycott, an invisible war waged in the city's commercial district. Starting in 1962, Evers and the NAACP meticulously organized the black community, distributing leaflets and establishing a silent picket line that urged citizens to "don't buy segregation." The discipline of the community was absolute. Businesses that had once thrived on black custom saw their profits plummet. This economic pressure, the silent siege, was the first tactical success. It was followed by the second phase, direct action. This phase required courage that bordered on the suicidal. Evers deliberately escalated the confrontation by organizing read-ins at the segregated public library and sit-ins at Woolworth's lunch counter. The goal was to force the city's resistance out of the legal shadows and into the glaring light of publicity. One of the most powerful examples of this operational tempo occurred in late May 1963. Evers had planned a series of demonstrations in Jackson's downtown, knowing the city officials, determined to maintain order through violent suppression, would retaliate. He used local black students, disciplined young soldiers in his nonviolent army, as the shock troops. When the students marched peacefully toward the Capitol building, they were met by police dogs, tear gas, and state troopers wielding batons. Evers and his team meticulously documented every instance of police brutality. The images of well-dressed, dignified students being savaged by dogs or beaten by officers were not random photographs. They were operational intelligence, gathered and immediately transmitted to national news outlets. Evers understood the American media landscape of the time. The most effective weapon against Jim Crow was the visual evidence of its inhumanity broadcast into the living rooms of the North. The city's strategy was to rely on brute force and legal obstruction. Evers' strategy was to rely on nonviolent discipline and moral exposure. The local police, trained only for immediate suppression, were constantly outmaneuvered. Every arrest was a tactical victory for the movement, filling the jails and stretching the city's resources while providing compelling personal stories for the national press. Evers became the central nervous system of this campaign, coordinating the logistics, managing the media, and calming the fears of the community. The Jackson campaign was a sustained operational victory. It did not immediately dismantle the entire system, but it broke the illusion of peace and order that Mississippi depended upon. It forced the administration of President John F. Kennedy to pay attention. The campaign demonstrated that the discipline learned in the segregated military could be turned inward to create an unstoppable nonviolent resistance force. Evers had engineered a successful invasion of the social status quo, proving that logistics, documentation, and the strategic use of moral force were weapons far more effective than the empty rhetoric of segregationists.
The story of Medgar Evers cannot be understood without pulling back to reveal the scale of the machinery he confronted and the forces he was marshaling. On one side stood the industrial scale of segregation, a vast, self-perpetuating system built by the political and economic structure of the American South. This was not just a collection of bigoted individuals, it was an apparatus of state-sanctioned oppression. The infrastructure of Jim Crow involved a legal system designed to deny basic rights, an economic structure that ensured black citizens were confined to menial, low-paying labor, and a state security apparatus, the local police, state troopers, and organizations like the White Citizens Council, whose primary function was to maintain the racial caste system. This machine was lubricated by generations of tradition and shielded by the doctrine of states' rights, making it a formidable geopolitical obstacle within the nation itself. It was a factory of injustice, relentlessly producing fear and inequality. Against this monolithic power, Medgar Evers and the civil rights movement mobilized a different kind of strategic scale, the power of mass moral production. Their assets were not factories, but people. Their production line was the continuous, disciplined commitment to nonviolence, and their product was moral clarity. Evers's organizational structure was designed for high-yield impact. He was part of a national network, the NAACP, which provided legal aid, funding, and media access.
This national scope allowed him to translate local acts of defiance in the Mississippi Delta into national headlines and political pressure on Washington, D.C. The scale of this operation was immense. It involved coordinating thousands of individuals, managing donations, recruiting lawyers, and creating a continuous stream of reports and publicity materials. The most potent production Evers oversaw was the creation of the veteran activist. His success in mobilizing returning black veterans was key. These were not random recruits. They were men who had been exposed to the world, trained in discipline and sacrifice, and armed with the conviction that they had earned a place in society. They became the reliable core of the voter registration drives and the public demonstrations. They were the shock troops of the moral campaign, their uniforms and service records providing an irrefutable counter-narrative to the segregationist lie of black inferiority. In the strategic context of the Cold War, Evers's work achieved a geopolitical scale. The systemic oppression of black Americans was a profound source of international embarrassment for the United States. Soviet propaganda hammered the U.S. with images of police brutality and racial discrimination, undermining America's moral claim to global leadership. Thus, the fight in Jackson, Mississippi was not just a local struggle, it was a front in the international ideological war. Every time Evers successfully challenged a segregated institution, he was scoring a point in the global contest between democracy and communism. His work in the dusty, segregated South was, paradoxically, helping to win the Cold War. The personal fight of the soldier who returned home became the most vital strategic necessity for the entire nation. The campaign in Jackson and Medgar Evers' relentless work had successfully breached the wall of silence surrounding Mississippi's brutality. He had forced the confrontation, exposing the rot at the heart of the system for the entire nation to see. But the power structure, once challenged, never surrenders quietly. The victory of moral clarity often comes at an unimaginable human cost. In the late evening of June 12, 1963, just hours after President Kennedy delivered a landmark national address on civil rights, a speech that had been partially forced by the constant pressure of Evers's activities, Medgar Evers returned to his home. He pulled into his driveway carrying a handful of "Jim Crow Must Go" t-shirts from a meeting. As he stepped out of his car, a shot rang out from the darkness of a honeysuckle thicket across the street. He was struck in the back by a bullet fired from an Enfield 1917 rifle, the kind of military weapon used by many veterans of the World Wars. Evers collapsed in his own driveway, dying hours later at the segregated University Hospital, the very system he had fought so hard to dismantle. The irony was devastating. A decorated veteran killed on his own property by a civilian who was attempting to defend the tyranny he had faced down on the beaches of Normandy. His death was not an ending, it was a detonation. The calculated violence was intended to terrorize, to silence the movement. Instead, it did the opposite. Evers's murder galvanized the nation. The stark image of a hero veteran assassinated for exercising his constitutional rights provided the irrefutable evidence that the time for incremental change was over. The immediate legacy of his death was the massive outpouring of grief and outrage that led directly to the acceleration of national civil rights legislation. His funeral in Arlington National Cemetery, attended by thousands, was a profound public acknowledgement that his struggle was not a local protest, but a national military fight for the soul of America. The sight of his casket, draped in the American flag, being lowered into the ground in a place of national honor, was the final, devastating indictment of the system that killed him. His service in the war, once a badge of honor he hoped would grant him equality, became the ultimate symbol of his sacrifice. He had given his life twice, once by risking it for the world in Europe, and again by giving it for his own people in Mississippi. The price of liberty, he proved, was not paid on one continent alone.
The arc of Medgar Evers' life is a perfect, chilling mirror of America's struggle with its own conscience. He went to war in a segregated army to fight for a nation that did not fully claim him, only to discover that the greatest battle lay waiting on his return. He traded the landing craft of Omaha Beach for the segregated voting booths of Jackson, Mississippi. The great moral irony is that the ideology he fought in Europe, racial supremacy, gave him the tools and the moral high ground to fight its American cousin, Jim Crow. His overseas service stripped him of any obligation to accept a diminished status, equipping him instead with discipline, strategy, and an unshakable conviction in the universality of human rights. He had seen the world and found the South wanting. He did not live to see the passage of the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964 or the Voting Rights Act of 1965. But these legislative victories, the dismantling of the machine he fought so hard against, were constructed on the foundation of his intelligence, his strategy, and his ultimate sacrifice. He was the field commander of a campaign that broke the logistical and psychological will of institutionalized racism. The final truth of Medgar Evers is simple and profound. He proved that the uniform he wore was not merely a costume of service, but a guarantee of citizenship. When he stepped off that troopship in 1946, he did not ask for his rights, he declared them, his actions backed by the terrible, glorious authority of a combat veteran who understood the difference between a tyrant and a free man. He fought for America abroad, and then he was forced to fight the deepest, most dangerous part of it at home. In his death, Medgar Evers ensured that the democracy he helped save from an external enemy would, eventually, save itself from an internal one. The silence that followed the single rifle shot was soon broken by the thundering, unstoppable march toward equality that he had so patiently, so deliberately set into motion. Would you like me to focus on another key figure from World War II or the Civil Rights Movement?